Hello again, everybody. Let me say I was honoured to be asked by Paul to launch his book here, and with the flyers outside you can get it at a discounted price. Reconstructing Agency in Developmental and Educational Psychology, Inclusive Systems as Concentric Space. Now, I have known Paul since he was an undergraduate student in Trinity. He transferred into psychology from law, where he had attained the status of scholar, and he soon came to excel in psychology and graduated with a first-class degree. Paul was then a very interesting and challenging young man. And now, in his mature years, if you don't mind my saying so, he remains interesting and challenging. There is another continuity I have noted, which is in his commitment to justice and his concern for the marginalised. As a student, he pushed the law school into including disadvantaged and access students in their BA programme. And since then, he has continued throughout his career to seek to remedy injustices where he sees them, through particularly in the educational system. And he's done this through founding the Educational Disadvantaged Centre here, and through his prolific and widely appreciated publications, and he's had many invitations to speak on his work internationally and nationally. Paul has always had a passionate interest in theory, and many academics share this interest, but for some, developing and critiquing theories is an end in itself. But Paul connects theory to practice. Theory is used as a means of increasing our understanding of our daily lives, improving society, and particularly our educational systems, and improving our treatment of those who are marginalised and excluded. Paul's theory about the fundamental nature and importance of spatial relations in psychology and in social systems, particularly for him in education, is embedded in an extraordinary scholarship. Paul's reading encompasses philosophy, sociology, anthropology, geography, art history, and more. And this fits for his desire, I think, for expansion and his refusal to be hamstrung by boundaries. To appreciate the significance of his argument is not always easy. I think this is because he's calling upon us to rethink something we rarely think about, that is our existence in space. As a developmental psychologist, I'm used to thinking about time and less about space as such, although context, ecology, and relationality are terms and concepts I have come to use much more since being very convinced by the work of Bronfenbrenner and his very well-known text, The Ecology of Human Development, published in 1979 and discussed by Paul in his book and in other of his publications. And part of what Paul is doing in this book is to critique Bronfenbrenner, both in his later work and his early work. Interestingly, he asks us to revisit and revalue the early work, although he identifies deficits in it. And he revitalizes the ubiquitous diagram, which you've probably all seen, any of you who've studied psychology, in many child development textbooks. The one of concentric levels of systems that influence the child's development. Paul is exploring the possibilities offered by the idea of concentric spaces and using terms from, I think originally Levi-Strauss, contrasts concentric space with diametric space. He sees both as organizing structures in space. Diametric space involves opposition and polarities, which can take many different forms. So things like high, low, good, bad, them, us. It's associated with binary ways of thinking and binary ways of acting. And he gives many examples in this book of the sometimes toxic ways in which thinking in this diametric way and organizing society or our educational systems in this diametric opposition, so that the teacher is seen as higher than and more at a different level from students, and students are seen as lesser. And it's the hierarchies, the exclusions, the differentiations that are made in the educational system can so often be damaging to children and young people. These binaries then are contrasted, on the other hand, with concentric ways of thinking and acting, which are about connection and possibility, and which eschew hierarchies. What is interesting then is Paul applies his ideas about diametric and concentric systems of relation to social systems and also to our lived experience. In the central 5 chapters of the book, he argues convincingly for an identification and avoidance of diametric thinking and practice in schools, which leads to this them-us thinking, the violence perhaps of bullying, the child who is perceived as where the child is often perceived as other, and bullying, of course, can take place from teacher to pupil as well as between pupils. And all the exclusionary practices which can lead to early school leaving and to poorer mental health in our children. Paul argues that a shift to seeing educational systems as concentric spaces would lead to many of these toxic practices ending. And this is a sort of a reimagining of how we operate in the education system and how we operate around children. And I think it's very inspirational, actually, that so many people have talked in this way from the panel and in this room about the necessity to reimagine. And we can use this awful crisis we've been through and are living through and maybe as a way of rethinking schools, or not even calling them schools. I love that idea. Pupils, then, should be not blamed or feel belittled in the system, but the system should be open to examination at all levels of the ecology. Inevitably, this should lead to the development of more support system. This is going to take money and investment, but and all of you in this room know the need for this. So I'm speaking totally to the converted. But somehow or other we need to convince other people with the money to invest in children and in education in a way that they have not done to date in this country. Paul identifies examples of how systems could work and should work, and I think this is very important, and you'll find those in those central chapters if it's the practice side of things that interests you most. But it does start with a shift in thinking, which is where theory can come in. So for Paul, agency, and he talks about this this book is about agency. Agency is enabled when movement is enabled, particularly in concentric space. Agency is not inherent in the individual, but exists in relations, and that I agree with. As Paul mentioned, I've just written a book on agency with Professor Liz Nixon, Children as Agents in Their World. I think it's probably very bad form to mention your own new book. Launching somebody else's new book. But anyway, I don't know. And I hope there's some similarities and some differences, very interesting in the way that we think, and I hope we can discuss that at some later date. And Paul has actually proposed a joint seminar, which I hope we can conduct, and I hope some of you will be able to attend. I think what we do share is a respect for the dignity and personhood of children and adults, and a fundamentally relational perspective on human psychology. So Paul asks, how is agency enabled? How does the individual challenge and change societal norms and conditioning and avoid being, as he uses the term from Garfinkel, a cultural dupe? And dope, maybe. Agency is enabled then through this concentric organisation of space, and thrives when doesn't and is thwarted when diametric spaces and ways of organising space and thinking about people and children dominate. I am particularly taken by Paul's view that experience is neglected. People's experience, their own personal experience of the world, is neglected in psychology and in educational practice. And he talks about the dual neglect of experience and space. Here again, Paul shows his ability to link his theory to practice, talking of the need to encourage self-reflexivity in students, to give them space to be themselves and think for themselves. And we often fail to do this in an education system which is constantly hurrying and harassing them into doing something else, to following an agenda often set by adults. Giving students the time then and the space to connect with themselves, a deeper world of feeling and experience. And he gives some nice examples from his work in 2004 of 11 to 12-year-old girls talking in this way when they were asked about the need for silence and solitude. And they say, I would love if there was a room like that because I have a lot to think about. Yes, that's a good idea because I think you might need to think about a problem. No, there's no room in my school, but I would really like them. Yes, there's no room like that in our school. I think it would be a good idea, a great idea, because you don't need people shouting and you sometimes need your space to think. If you had some peace, it would be a good idea. There's too much noise in the house, so I go to the library to hear myself think. Children need space and time to think and reflect, and I think that's an important aspect of what Paul is talking about. This world, this deeper world of feeling and experience. And through this, children can tap into their own resources and their own thoughts about the world around them, or the school experience, their relationship with teachers, and become resistant, perhaps, to the demands and norms of the external world, and to be themselves as people with initiative and with agency in the world, and agency that is supported by the systems around them. So to finish, this is a stimulating, challenging, thought-provoking book. Can I say it's definitely not bedtime reading? But it certainly repays reading, and I certainly recommend that you read it. I hope Paul's ideas are taken up by other theorists and by practitioners, and that they serve to give agency, in his words, to give agency to those who are excluded in particular. Paul has already done much to do this, to give agency to those who are excluded, I think, amongst his many achievements. I look forward to seeing where his original mind and passionate convictions take him next. Thank you.